He's the man from New Hampshire who was instrumental in Donald Trump's 2016 win in the New Hampshire primary, ultimately catapulting him to the White House. Can he do it again in 2024? And can Donald Trump win New Hampshire in the general election? Something he has yet to do. We asked Corey Lewandowski.
New Hampshire GOP Chair Chris Hager, I talked to him this week here in Milwaukee. He said he believes Donald Trump is a changed man since that event. Is that the sense you're getting?
Well, I've had the chance to spend some time speaking with the former president, who's been a great friend of mine for a long time. And I don't think anybody who has gone through a harrowing event like that, an attempted assassination, and, you know, what we saw this week in Milwaukee was that giant bandage over the president's ear in remembrance of what happened. You know, if he had not turned his head slightly, this country would be in mourning. We'd be thoroughly divided. So do I think Donald Trump realizes he's human? Sure, I do. Do I think this may bring some spirituality, hopefully, not just to President Trump, but to the country? I don't think anybody, regardless of your politics, wants to see someone hurt because of where they fall on the political spectrum. So the president, and he was very clear about this early on in the week out in Milwaukee, he said, I had a speech, I tore it up, and I delivered something different.
Everybody talked on the floor yesterday. Unity seems to be this message that it's not just about the party coming together to rally around their now nominee, but also for unity for the country. We've also heard, you know, like you just mentioned, the speech was changed in terms of trying to strike that right tone. Are we going to see moderation in policy or just in language?
Well, I think when you look at this country's history, when we've had significant events, tragic events, you think of the Civil War and what Abraham Lincoln did to bring the country together. You think of 9/11 and what George W. Bush did to bring this country together, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans. And there is a clear dichotomy of what the Republican Party stands for and what the Joe Biden administration stands for. And so this election, you know, we're going to have differences of opinion. Joe Biden believes that we should have an open border. I think it should be closed. You know, Joe Biden has, you know, summarily destroyed our economy. I think when you give people tax cuts and they have more money in their pockets, they can make better decisions. So, look, these two parties are very different. That's not to say that we can't have honest conversations about it, but yelling at your neighbors and swearing at them doesn't win votes. So if the Republican Party wants to be successful long term, you have to go win the hearts and minds of people and ask them what's important to them. And you can disagree sometimes maybe with what Donald Trump says or Joe Biden says, but at the end of the day, this great country solves their problems at the ballot box, and then we move forward.
So to that end, Corey, you know New Hampshire so well. I mean, you were a pivotal part of the 2016 win for Donald Trump in New Hampshire that really propelled him ultimately to the presidency. But winning in the general election for a presidential candidate in New Hampshire has proved elusive now for 20 plus years. Does that change this year? And if so, why in your view?
So it does. Look, the last Republican to win was George W. Bush in 2000. So it's been 24 years since a Republican has won the general election up in the state of New Hampshire. I think the country's very different now. Every state is a border state. We actually are a border state. We're on the northern border. But when you look at the fentanyl crisis, the human smuggling, the human trafficking that's taken place across the southern border because of the policies of this administration and how quickly it's changed, you know, I don't think anybody in our great state has not been impacted by the fentanyl crisis that we have seen. We've seen loved ones, we've seen overdoses. You know, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, black, white, green, or orange. You know, drugs have no distinction of who they kill. And so to keep our children safe and our families safe, let's close the borders. I think we can win as a Republican Party in New Hampshire. We're completely unified. Donald Trump has been to New Hampshire so many times, it's like a second home. And I think you're going to see a lot of campaigning for him in New Hampshire in the fall.
So how does the Trump campaign bring in the folks who, you know, they wanted Nikki Haley, for instance, in the primary? There was a decent amount of push for that. Obviously, Governor Chris Sununu was really pushing Haley during the New Hampshire primary back in the winter. How does the Trump campaign bring those people into the fold and show that they, you know, they could be a part of that as well?
Well, look, the other thing we have now is we have a new tool in our tool belt. It's called J.D. Vance. You know, J.D. Vance is a man who served his country as a United States Marine. And what we've seen under the Biden administration is that many of those active duty members and veterans have been forgotten. So J.D. Vance has the opportunity to remind the New Hampshire voters that we're the only state in the country that doesn't have a full-service VA hospital. And Donald Trump is going to change that. Veterans need better care. And who knows that better than a veteran himself with J.D. Vance? So I think you're going to see him there as it relates to Nikki Haley, Ambassador Haley, a spokesperson spoke at the convention this week at the request of President Trump directly. I know that for sure. And she also released all of her delegates so that the state of New Hampshire could be unified in casting all 22 votes for Donald Trump, which I had the privilege to read that roll call earlier this week out in Milwaukee. So Nikki Haley understands what the American voters understand, that this is a two-person race. And if you don't support Donald Trump, by definition, you're probably supporting Joe Biden. So if you believe that under the last 3 years you are better off than you were 4 years ago, then you have a choice to return Joe Biden. But I think most people saw his debate performance and are truly calling into question if he's running the country and if he has the mental capacity to do it for another 4 years.
We've also been hearing about J.D. Vance this week. You know, he's really been introduced to the party in a new way, now taking on this vice presidential candidate role. At the same time, you know, it's a campaign, so a lot of people are going to go back to his statements 2016, 2015, when he had some not so nice things to say about Donald Trump. How do you think the campaign, obviously you've done campaigns for a while, how do you think the campaign kind of makes sure that those don't take hold? You assume the Democrats are going to run them in ad after ad. He called, you know, Trump essentially America's Hitler at one point, I believe. How do you guys make sure that somehow doesn't come through in your messaging?
Well, listen, I think there are a few people in this country, I happen to be one of them, who was there when Donald Trump came down the golden escalator, or before that. But we've seen a lot of converts since he's come down that escalator over the last 8 years. And what J.D. Vance, now vice presidential nominee, has said was he was wrong. And once he got to know Donald Trump, he changed his opinions. The same thing Governor Burgum has said, and so many others. Listen, Donald Trump has grown the Republican Party. He's grown independents. In 2016, Donald Trump got about 8% of the African-American vote. Today, he's getting 24% of the African-American vote. In 2016, he had about 24% of the Hispanic vote. Today, he's getting 46% of the Hispanic vote. So just because you weren't with Donald Trump when he descended that lovely golden escalator in New York doesn't mean you're not with him today. And understanding what his policies have done for this country while he was in the White House and knowing that he can do that again has brought all these new people to his team that wouldn't have been there a long time ago.
One of the things that we've heard Mr. Trump talk about is a potential 10% tariff on all incoming goods. Look, you know New Hampshire. We really don't like taxes in New Hampshire. How does that play in the Granite State?
Here's what he wants. He wants to be in a position of strength, to leverage our ability to put a tariff on goods if we don't have, you know, a lot of times we talk about fair trade or free trade. Sometimes it's fair to other people, but not the United States, or other countries are benefiting from it. Look, we've seen China rip us off and, you know, manipulate their currency and steal our intellectual property and then dump their goods on our markets, and we don't have an ability here to compete with what they're doing overseas. So, you know, to level the playing field so that we can have manufacturing back in this country, in New Hampshire, across, you know, our great land, is only fair. The job of the President of the United States is to put our people first, not the people of other countries. So Donald Trump has talked about using tariffs as a tool to allow and force these other countries to operate in good faith. And if they're not going to do that, there can be consequences to it.
And finally, Corey, I wanted to ask you about former President Trump. Obviously, I mean, he's gone through a lot in the last couple of weeks. We saw this message of unity at the RNC. And I heard you say earlier in the week that this election is about different visions for the country. You know, Joe Biden has his vision, Donald Trump has his vision. We've also heard Trump, though, say, I am your retribution from this stage, talking about vengeance from this stage, revenge from this stage, maybe even having the Justice Department go after his political opponents. Since what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, do you think that is still in somewhat the vision, or how would you describe Trump's vision? Because is he still going to be saying, I am your retribution?
I think Donald Trump's revenge is making America successful again. And that's what he talked about, right? Letting everybody share in our success. And, you know, it's interesting because we heard for a long time that Donald Trump was a threat to democracy from the left. And if, you know, he was elected again, democracy would fail. And we heard it from some of the pundits on television for a long time. This is not true. And Donald Trump, you know, the left can say what they want, but he has a record to stand on. And that didn't occur. A lot of people following the 2016 campaign wanted the Department of Justice to go after Hillary Clinton for the destruction of the server and the classified document mistakes and all the hammers and the bleep split. That never happened under a Trump administration. Donald Trump didn't use his Justice Department to go after his political enemies. Very different than what's occurred over the last 3 years here. So this notion that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy or is going to not leave the White House or is going to do something, it's rhetoric that the left has used very effectively because they know they've got a failed candidate who has a difficult time performing on a 90-minute debate stand. Look, they had to have Joe Biden practice standing. When I spoke to Donald Trump and I had the privilege to travel with him to the debate and be part of the debate prep team, I said, "Sir, do you want to practice standing?" He says, "Corey, if we're doing that, we're in big trouble." And so, look, what the American people saw with their own eyes is very different than what some of the media have told us about Joe Biden for a long time. They told us how sharp he was, how he was so engaged in asking such difficult policy questions that the National Security Advisor had to go and look up the answer. If that's the case, then this country's in much bigger trouble because we've seen with our own eyes how he has an inability to articulate full sentences anymore. He called himself the first black African-American female vice president. By the way, he's not. And so, look, this election in November could not be clearer about what's at stake. And we've got two candidates who both have a proven record. And at the end of the day, we're going to let the voters decide. And that's how the system works.
All right, Corey Lewandowski, we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.